The snow smashed the observatory door like a fist, and Mara pressed her forehead to the cold wood, listening to the life inside the instruments. Low hums, the patient tick of a clock, the radio array that had been whispering at her through the long nights, and felt her heart split with a sudden, stupid, furious hope. If this was the answer, everything she had given would stop being a debt and become a legacy. Then the knock came again. 3 slow, impossible taps that seemed measured against the beat of the universe itself. And when the door opened, the light on the steps showed a shape too tall and too pale to be human, leaning like a question into her threshold. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He smelled faintly of ozone and old rain. He wore nothing she would have called clothing, thin layers that clung to angles in a way that made her aware of how human bodies could fold and keep warmth. But his eyes were the strangest thing. Cold, dark, and steady, as if they had swallowed whole constellations and kept them quiet. "You decoded them," he said, without the cadence of a question, as if he had watched her at her desk for years. His voice was an instrument tuned to patient grief. Mara closed the door with both hands because she had been taught to close doors when they opened to miracles. "Deciphered," she corrected, because words mattered to her in the way a scientist counts signatures. "I found a pattern. It repeated with a non-random syntax, prime transitions. Her throat dried. "Who are you?" "Thorax," he answered, as if the name aged him and soothed him in a single syllable. "I am an envoy, which is both more and less than your words will hold. I came because you answered." She laughed then, a short, brittle sound. "There is no one for me to answer. There are radio pulses. There's data. There are nights that smell like burnt coffee and a sister's face at the edge of every sleepless hour. You don't—" Her voice broke. She hadn't meant to tell him about June, but the observatory had always been a hollow where memories flamed up and begged attention. "Why my house?" Thorax's gaze lingered on her hands, on the calluses earned by gripping cold metal and long nights. "Because you were listening when the universe whispered its taboo. Because of how you did it." He sounded tired, as if he had been walking for centuries. "Because you have a wound that will not let you walk away." That phrase, wound, wasn't intended comfort. It felt like diagnosis. Mara wanted to resist, wanted to ask to see papers, credentials, a government seal, a badge engraved with an emblem of an agency, anything to anchor this to known things. Instead, she felt something stranger, the precise physics of 2 people learning each other's thermal signature across a room. He was a threat and a promise, and the winter air did not make it easier to tell which. She dragged her fingers through her hair and thought of the pattern on her monitors, the impossible regularity of certain delays. For months, she had stayed after the graduate students left, after the observatory's funding reports were filed, unweaving a melody of pulses that repeated like the rhythm of a heart under duress. She'd thought the answer would be civilizational contact, a chance to move beyond the petty quarrels of nations. Instead, her work had become a ledger of secrets, a trace here, a shadow there, anomalies that government databases smoothed over like fingerprints on glass. She had expected a message. She hadn't expected a sentinel. Thorax stepped across her living room, moving as one might through water, and the rug beneath his feet did not seem to depress. He looked at the photographs pinned above her desk, June's smile at 23, the old family home before the estate sale, and his face didn't change, but his eyes softened. "You search because someone took one of your own," he said. "You seek because loss teaches you the geometry of absence." Blood turned hot in her ears. "You know her." "I know of her," Thorax corrected. "I have watched the arcs where your species intersected with other hands. Not all of those hands were gentle." The confession sat between them like smoke. The 10 places are a legal ledger of containment, sites of consequence. Our order preserved them to prevent harm. Your kind's curiosity and your kind's laws make them volatile. You should not see them, yet you can. That is why I am here. Mara should have been rational. She should have pushed him out, locked doors, called someone, anyone. Instead, despite every survival instinct honed by lab protocols and the cold calculus of grant committees, she felt the pull of a question. What are the 10 forbidden places? The words had a mythic taste, like dangling a key before a locked temple. Her hands trembled as she reached for the nearest chair. Why me? Why not a government envoy? Why not the UN? Why come to a dilapidated observatory in New Hampshire? The same reason you are not slept by the authorities, Thorax said. Because authorities sleep under doctrines that protect possession, not truth. Because you are small enough to be curious and stubborn enough to follow. Because of your sister. He said it again as if pronouncing a verdict. And because you opened the code like a child opens a locked box. There was a silence where the world recalibrated. Outside, the snow kept arriving in patient, anonymous sheets. Inside, the observatory felt suddenly enormous with possibility and peril. Mara wanted, more than she wanted anything, to ask about the technical details. How an envoy could have intercepted the pulses, what language the transmissions used, whether the delayed intervals were an artifact of subspace logistics or something intentionally cryptic. But the personal cut through the academic like a scalpel. "Show me," she said, before she could stop herself. It was dangerous, yes. It was possibly illegal in ways that would end careers, lives. It was also the urgent ache of everyone who had ever wanted to know what happened beyond the last line on a map. Tell me the first place. Thorax's face became an expression she couldn't name, part sorrow, part deferential delight. "The dead satellite graveyard," he said. The words were simple as a map pin. High orbit beyond your official tracking. A place where debris becomes relic, and relic becomes memory. We will take your body there, but not as your species expects. Mara's breath left her. Beyond official tracking meant beyond the safety of any law she knew. It meant he could take her into places where treaties and paper births had no weight. It meant trust. She thought of her sister again, thought of the way June's last message had been so measured and then suddenly static. If the graveyard held relics of lives stolen, if the cosmos had learned to hoard human things, then the ledger of grief she carried might be one more signature in a file Thorax could open. "Why would you show me?" she asked. "If your order's purpose is to keep these closed, why break it?" Thorax smiled in a way that made the corners of his eyes crinkle with decades. "Because my order is not monolith. Because laws have fractures. Because curiosity can be its own kind of rebellion. Because there is a debt in my throat, and only your species can pay it forward." He lifted his hand as if offering a pact. "Because you will matter to what comes." Mara should have asked what the debt was. She should have asked for credentials and assurances. She should have refused and called the authorities, or at least turned him over to the nearest person with a badge. But something else was stronger. The ache for meaning that had braided itself through her lonely years in the lab. She had spent nights imagining a delicate diplomacy that would rewrite all the ways humans measured themselves against the universe. If this envoy carried both the temptation and the instruction manual, she couldn't simply put the manual down. "All right," she said, and it felt like stepping off a cliff with a map in her pocket. "One place. I come with questions and a notebook. I will not sign away my rights." Thorax inclined his head. "Neither of those will save you from what you will see, Mara Ellison. Rights are small words against the architecture of the known and the forbidden. They will not hold the terror or the beauty. but they will give you something to write with. They prepared in awkward halves. Mara gathering her field kit, a thermal jacket, a camera that recorded more than colors, a hard drive with encrypted backups. Thorax pulling from the air, a device that folded light into a corridor with a sound like a cathedral bell. He moved history without fanfare. Under his touch, an old transmitter hummed awake, and the observatory's array twisted its small face toward a sky that had been cooperating with her for years, and now seemed to be in on a secret she hadn't been invited to. "How will we travel?" she asked, fumbling with straps and thoughts. Her fingers did not stop trembling. Thorax's smile was private. "The first is near your moon, in an orbital seam the satellites avoid. We will be there in a way your instruments will not track. Close your eyes, Mara Ellison. Let your mind tether to the question you solved. It will be your compass." It was an invitation and a danger. Stepping into it meant siding with curiosity against the greasy legal hands that had taken her sister and erased entire margins of truth. It meant trusting a being whose presence rearranged the space in the room like a new gravity. She felt tiny and enormous at once, the way human beings do when they decide to love or to leave. She took a breath and let the observatory's world dissolve into something thin and humming. The instrument sent a last loyal beep. Snow sheeted against the glass like a curtain. Then Thorax reached out and took her hand in a way that made the hair on her arms stand upright, not like the touch of a human, but like a signal pressed into skin. She understood in an instinct older than rational thought. There would be no safe harbor after this, only 10 doors and the choice to open them. The first seam of space felt like being unwound. One moment, the observatory had been a room of familiar sounds. The kettle clicked, the radiator sighed. Then it folded like paper and became an archway of cold light. Mara's stomach behaved as if it had been left behind somewhere warm. She thought of gravity in the language of equations, and none of those equations comforted her now. Thorax did not so much move through the corridor as make it happen. His hand on her palm was steady, patient, and insistence. The world beyond the seam smelled of metal and salt, of 2 bright stars, and a loneliness so deep it made the hair on her forearms ache. When the seam released them, they were not in the empty black she had imagined, but in a sea of relics that orbit a forgotten moon, the dead satellite graveyard. It was an ecumenical ruin, twisted panels, plaques in languages she couldn't parse, a child's toy frozen in mid-arc, a wedding band that caught the starlight and flared like a small sun. The pieces floated with lazy dignity, grinding occasionally against one another in the long, slow motion of things that no longer had a purpose but could not die either. Mara's breath fogged the visor of the field helmet Thorax had fitted onto her with gentle impatience. He seemed smaller here, if anything, reduced not by proximity, but by the enormity of what surrounded them. He walked like someone who had memorized the geometry of every ruin and knew which steps would wake what echo. "They are not dead by our definitions," he said quietly, as though reading the thoughts she had not yet dared to think. "They are preserved." By whom? It was a stupid, clumsy question, because the answer complicated everything she had been preparing for. If humans had been preserved, taken, tended, archived, then the neat narrative of isolation and sudden first contact dissolved into long, culpable shadows of complicity. Who archived them? Thorax's jaw tightened. "We have an archive duty. There are custodians. Not all of our kind agree on the scope. Some believe in letting patterns extinguish on their own. Others, like me in a previous iteration, think preservation is a mercy." His voice softened in a way that made Mara's chest pinch. These were taken because someone decided the price of openness was too high. They drifted close to a cluster of fragments that included a dented module stamped with NASA insignia and a faded flag painted by someone who'd wanted to mark ownership in the small human way. an identity painted across the sky. A child's fabric doll, its face bleached and smiling, was entangled in a lattice of wire like an offering. Mara felt her fingers curl against her suit's harness. Every piece carried an origin story, a family, a day that had been cut short. She had come for codes and cosmic signatures. Instead, she found the intimate debris of human lives. She reached out, hand steady despite the tremor in her heart, and the doll swung. It made a small, absurd sound against metal, like a bell. June liked green, she said, and it was not a question. Thorax watched the motion of her lips and the soft reconfiguration of her face, the way grief rearranged features into a map, and he did not look away. "I cannot give you all the names," he said. "Some are claimed by your agencies. Some were taken by others. We catalog by consequence and capacity, by whether the removal may fracture whole systems if revealed. The first place is a library of things, not of answers. But there are traces." He reached into a pocket of light at his belt and produced a slim shard that vibrated like a bee. He schemed it near a panel, and the shard unwound a ribbon of data in a language Mara's machines read with the lazy competence of old friends. Her HUD lit up with transliterations and fuzzy audio. A child's voice, a transmission tagged 2043-0311, static, and then declarity of a syllable she recognized. June. Her throat closed on a sound that was part sob, part scientific denial. Her hands hovered over the readouts. She had trained herself to be empirical, to be the kind of person who could sit with a data set and not become the data. But the audio was not a sterile artifact. It's a voice. The world had cruelly gifted her a human sound in the midst of impossible audit. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Because there are forms of theft that look like rescue." Thorax's eyes were not opaque now. There was a fissure of something like pity. "From an archival node at the heart of the cluster," he said. "The custodians sometimes keep recordings, small, unremarkable objects that feel like living things to your species. They believed a sound could not harm our order. They were wrong. It should have been simple cruelty, her sister's voice preserved like a fossil for others to watch under museum lights. Instead, the recording was unprocessed, real, a message half-made and then torn. The rest was static and a cadence that made Mara clench her fists until the knuckles whitened. The spectral logic of the archive gnawed at her. It was both atrocity and evidence, a ledger of what had been taken and what had been kept in a state of soothing half-life. "You could bring her back?" The words escaped before she thought them through. They were the wish that had been a cotillion of every lonely night, that someone could undo the taking with a flip of an instrument, a reversal of a policy. Thorax's face closed like a book. "No," he said, "not as she was. Not without rewriting more than one covenant. We cannot untake histories without the consent of those who were storied and those who took. Some things we keep to prevent the unraveling of oaths. Some things we keep because we have no right to decide their termination." Mara felt the room tilt under the weight of that refusal. He had offered her a sliver, voices, trinkets, traces. And when she reached for it, it had the brittle resistance of ancient glass. "Then why show me?" she demanded. "If you are guardians who keep what would hurt us, why bring me here to watch the wounds?" "Because you already carry one," Thorax said. "Because there is a fracture in your consanguinity with your institutions. You hold a memory of injustice your own governments will not accept. You need evidence that will not be comfortable for them to absorb. And because some among my kind, myself among them, have learned that secrecy breeds violence." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was a tremor that made Mara's heart kick. "I cannot change the past, but I can tilt the ledger." Staring at the doll that had been June's, Mara realized that the tilt he offered was not a solution, but a decision. To make visible what institutions would bury. To name what the bureaucratic machine would hide behind classification codes. To take that decision would mean becoming a public wound, a target. It would mean losing the arcane safety that ignorance affords. Anger rose quickly, a furnace in her chest. It was a familiar heat. She had been angry at the agencies that closed doors, at the committees that prioritized national security over families, at the graduate dean who had told her to publish later. "Then tell me everything," she said, sharp. "All 10, all the custodians. Give me the map so I can find the rest. If you want to tilt a ledger, give me the whole balance." Thorax's smile was soft and grief-lined. "You would ask a child to carry a world," he said. "Some of those places are not for you. They are vents in the architecture of responsibility, designs meant to hold back a tide. Opening them without the capacity to hold that tide changes the equation. I will show you the 10 in time, but not all at once. The cost is measured in the ways knowledge hurts. Each place you enter will mark you. Each will require a covenant that will not let you simply return to your old life." Mara's fists opened. The idea that knowledge could mark you was not metaphysical in the way she liked to imagine. It was bureaucratic, chemical. It would be a list of consequences and surveillance, of loss of freedom. But something warmer, an ember of desperate courage, glowed inside her. She had lost June to those very consequences she now weighed. If marking meant trade for the chance to press against the machinery that had taken her sister, she might accept the ledger. "I'll take it," she said. He nodded, an almost imperceptible capitulation. "Then the second place will require different tools. We cannot open it in orbit." They returned to the seam the way they had arrived, a silent unwillingness that made the observatory's walls seem suddenly thin. The snow that whispered against the glass sounded like the page of a book being slowly turned. Mara unstrapped the helmet with stiff fingers and let the air of her home, misty with old coffee and the faint chemical tang of solder, wash over her. In the pale domestic light, Thorax's presence felt intrusive, like a cosmic winter coming to stay for tea. "You should sleep," he said, as if it were common courtesy. But his posture carried the tired patience of someone who had watched 2 civilizational crescendos and bore the scars. "The second place is underwater. It is shallow to your kind, but deep to the agreements. It will require proof of life, of—" He hesitated. For the first time he seemed to weigh a word. "Of rights." She felt exposed by the use of that vocabulary. Rights had been her shield against the world. "Tell me how deep," she said, bluntly. "If there's a submerged facility, if it houses hybrid children as you hinted, I'll need partners, legal counsel, a way to document without getting leaks." "Legal counsel will want to own the data," Thorax interrupted gently. "That is how you lose more than you gain. You want allies, yes, but not advocates who will turn a truth into a weapon for power." His eyes found hers with an intensity that made her flinch. "Elias Voss will be interested. He is a human who works for the ledger keepers. He believes containment is a form of mercy. He will see my presence as a breach to correct." The name landed on her like a stone. Elias. She had read about him in passing, a specter in government reports, a fixer. He was the kind of operative whose signatures were redacted with reverence. "So there are humans in charge of this too," she said. "Custodians of secrets on our side, not just yours." "Why would they hide children? For experiments? For control," Thorax answered without flourish. "Ownership is always profitable. Children born of mixed genes are potential leverage. They are mystery and material, vulnerable and valuable. Some of your agencies have believed themselves the rightful heirs to such leverage. The second place is a test of whether your species will defend its progeny as living beings or as classified assets. The bones of her discomfort sharpened into a blade. If they are human, if they are children with human blood, then we have a moral duty. We can't just— No, Thorax said, but do not confuse duty with naivete. There will be trade-offs. Exposure risks reprisals. Rescuing without a plan risks scattering them into worse hands. You would ask a scientist for a single answer to an ethical conundrum, Mara Ellison. There is none. She hated the truth in that. She wanted a clean path. Find the children, broadcast, free them. But she had spent the last decade watching institutions contort truth into policy and policy into profit. Thorax's caution was not only alien reticence, it was a kind of worldly intelligence. Then we plan, she said, voice small and furious. We plan like scientists. We gather data, allies, and options. We prevent the ledger keepers from turning lives into currency. Thorax's smile was almost tender. That is why I came to you, he said. You plan like a scientist. You do not see people as solely sentimental beings. You measure, but you do not forget. You search for answers, and you fear the cost. Both are necessary. There it was, the ache in his words again, threaded with a humility that made something inside her pulse with an unfamiliar warmth. He was not simply a guide. He was someone who had argued with his own code. The power imbalance between them burned bright. He could show and withhold. He could step away from law his kind had carved. He had access to corridors she did not. Yet within that inequality was a strain of trust he seemed willing to risk, and the risk was intoxicating. That night, she lay awake on the observatory's little cot and thought of June's laugh in a cassette long since recorded and now echoing in a foreign archive. She thought of Thorax's hand on hers, the way it fit like a key, though the key could not be returned. She thought of Elias Voss, an agent in the wings who represented the human loyalty to secrecy, the kind of man who could turn a leak into a purge. The observatory hummed with small comforts. The radiator breathed a polite animal. Outside, the world slept under a white pall that made everything seem like a painting. Inside, a woman who had sought the universe's secrets had stepped into a web of custodianship and bargaining. The knowledge that awaited her would change others' lives, possibly fracture institutions, maybe bring June into a frame she could recognize. It would mark her, too, her name, her career, her soul. She realized the truth of Thorax's earlier words. This path required carrying a world where every open door cut a new edge. But she had never been able to walk away from a question that insisted. This was not purely intellectual. It was moral, intimate, a reckoning that asked her whether she would let the universe keep its monstrous quiet, or whether she would take on the danger of illumination. In the corner of the room, a heater winked and clicked. Mara imagined Elias Voss learning of her actions, an operant's radar sweeping across the modest maps of her life, and she felt both rage and a prickling fear. The thought of him arriving with orders and the authority to obliterate evidence left a metallic taste in her mouth. She lay there, heart thudding, and felt the strain of two loyalties pulling at her: the human systems that rewarded compliance, and the essential lonely love of truth. Morning came as a fragile compromise, light that did not promise safety. Thorax was ready, or as ready as he ever seemed. His posture had that patient grief again, like an old soldier about to step into the place where he had once failed. Mara packed her recorder, her hard drives, copies of her decoded files. She wrote June's name on a scrap of paper and folded it into her pocket like an amulet. "We'll need eyes on the water," she said. "Small drones, footage, legal cover, persons of trust." Thorax studied her hands. "You gather them," he said. "But remember, trust is a resource. Give it only where it will hold." She nodded. That admonition settled into her like a lesson from a mentor. She was, for all the shock and the fervor, still a scientist. She would collect data, allies, and contingencies. She would test hypotheses. That her sister's record would give them leverage. That Elias Voss would move to protect the ledger. That Thorax's broken allegiance could become an axis for change. What she did not anticipate was how Thorax looked at her when she said these things. The tilt of his head like a comet's tail, eyes like dark glass reflecting instruments, and a woman who had finally decided not to be small. In that look lay a promise of danger and of something else, less definable, the beginning of a tether that could become love or ruin. Mara's breath snagged on the word. She had loved before in tidy domestic consumptions. This felt raw, a thing grown in the cold between stars. Outside, the snow had begun to melt into the hard, exposed road of winter's end. Inside, two beings prepared to breach custody, to pull at threads that led through human agencies and alien compacts. The pull of what they might unravel sat between them like static, tense, and alive. Mara found herself thinking of thresholds, doors, covenants, the seam through which they'd come. Each threshold demanded a choice. She had chosen once already. She tightened a strap on her pack and looked up. "Then let's go find the second place," she said, careful and fast. Thorax inclined his head, and for a moment his alien face held the warmth of a conspirator. "Careful," he echoed, "and ready for the price." The water that took them was not the cinematic abyss Mara had imagined, no yawning maw or cathedral of kelp, but a hushed, glassy cove that lived under a mapped lake where a research town kept tidy records. They arrived at night. The lake's surface held the moon like a coin, and the observatory's instruments had not yet learned to name what slipped beneath. Thorax moved with the ease of someone who had spent his life negotiating the seams of natural law. Mara moved with the clumsy, fierce attention of a woman carrying a folded name in her pocket. The entrance to the submerged facility smelled of iron and old sea. A hangar shifted in the shallow dark, a human-made lip over something not quite human-made at all. Thorax produced from a seam of air a thin membrane that painted the wet world into a language her instruments could translate. Light that showed structural geometry, heat signatures masked from satellites, a cascade that would let them pass without being logged by municipal arrays. He was elegant in his economy. Mara had never seen a person move with such economy of gesture and yet leave such disruption in his wake. "We will need to be quick," he said. "There are custodians among your own who consider this a well-kept account. Some wish only to audit. Others will seize. And the children, remember, they may not rescue as you imagine it." The words lodged like a splinter. Mara wrapped both hands around the recorder strapped to her chest as if it could anchor her to the ground. She had pictured announcements and outraged committees, not the intimate terror of children sleeping like seeds in a chamber someone had decided to classify. The moral equation she had rehearsed 100 times dissolved into a single urgent vector. Reach the children alive. Get proof. Keep the proof from being monetized. They breached the facility in a place where algae had learned to braid metal. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and something sweetly chemical, like the smell of a hospital the first morning light touches. Light from Thorax's device carved patterns on the walls. Images hung in negative on the corridor, like ghost postcards of prior lives. Schematic diagrams, a child's handprint preserved in resin, a poster promising tomorrow's health today. The show of benign progress was a manuscript of consent forms. It took only a flicker of the right translator for the euphemisms to peel away. Mara's boots made the soft sound she had loved, the echo of a thing that mattered, the sound of a scientist alive in a place built for the living. They followed a line of low hums to a chamber that smelled faintly of citrus and the sleep of machines. Rows of pods lay arranged like beds at a clinic, each containing a faintly breathing silhouette. Light from Thorax's device washed over them, and translations scrolled into Mara's HUD with the sterile cruelty of a spreadsheet. Project Custodian. Hybrids, Class Beta. Genetic admixtures. Human, 62 to 79%. Foreign markers, stabilized. Status, indeterminate. Mara crouched beside a pod and peered in through the condensation. A child, no more than 7, maybe 6, slept with a hand pressed to his or her mouth, eyelashes like little arcs. The child's hair had the wrong geometry for purely human growth. It lay in subtle, almost imperceptible waves. Had her training not been a steadying force, she would have fallen into the impulse that made researchers lean closer until they hurt, wanting to touch, to determine, to coax a sound. Instead, she recorded, fingers steady, voice low. "We are here. My name is Mara. You are." The child's eyelids fluttered like pages and then settled. The breath, the rise and fall of a chest, confirmed reality. These were lives, not variables. Mara felt something swell, a protective, parental heat that she had not expected. The thought of agencies calling them property tightened her chest with rage. A sound cut the hush. A rotor, muffled yet precise, like a hand turning a key. The doorway, one entrance they'd assumed sealed, shifted, and the room's engineering lights flashed with an official blue. Figures came through on a practiced cadence. Men and women in dark suits moved with the efficient silence of people who had been trained to turn everything into paperwork. At their head, as if he had paced himself to a beat the room used to keep, came Elias Voss. He had the hard, professional look of someone who had spent his life closing doors. Up close, he wore restraint like armor, thin-lipped, impatient with drama. He looked at Thorax the way a man looks at a problem he's expected to solve, counting edges and risk even as his eyes catalogued the children and the custodial setup. When his gaze flicked to Mara, it registered her as an unexpected variable, not entirely welcome, not entirely ignorable. "You shouldn't be here," Elias said, and the sentence was a verdict. There was no warmth. "Thorax, you bring aliens into human facilities and you call it diplomacy." Thorax's face was a striking wash of patient mileages. "You could have come to us with your concerns," he said. "Instead, you chose to classify." "We classify for a reason," Elias replied. "Containment prevents harm. You," he glanced at Mara, a slight, almost imperceptible narrowing, as if measuring her for strength, "and your curiosity could put these children at risk." Mara felt her blood boil. "They are children, Elias," she said. "If you are arguing for containment as a moral stance, you are arguing for property. You can't put a child's life in a ledger and call it mercy." Elias's jaw tightened. "I follow orders." The phrase was a shield he wore often. It was both comfortable and incomplete. "There are legal and ethical frameworks you don't understand, Dr. Ellison."
"There are treaties that predate your nation. There are worse things than custodial care." "Like secrecy," Mara shot back. "Like experiments in the name of safety. Like giving away lives for leverage." Thorax stepped between them in a movement that was neither wholly human nor wholly indifferent. "You both speak from your own doctrines," he said. "Your problem is that neither doctrine trusts the other. Your institutions believe in ownership. You believe in rights. This facility was created as a compromise. My people witnessed the early transfers and codified a neutral space. Your agents converted that space into inventory." Elias's face darkened. "That is a serious accusation." "It is a fact," Thorax replied. "We have logs, we have archives. Your agencies kept records and then reclassified them. The moral weight of your species weighs less than the balance sheet in some quarters." He looked at Mara. "You wanted evidence. This is evidence." Elias's eyes flicked to the children, then back to Thorax. For a sliver of time, Mara thought she saw something sharp unspool behind his eyes. calculation, then apology, then a settling into duty. "We will secure the site," he said. "We will take custody of the records. We will ensure the children's safety under national law." "No," said Mara, without thinking through the storm of consequences she was inviting. "You will not take custody unless I can ensure independent oversight. No single agency will decide their fate." Elias's lips tightened into a pale line. Independent oversight means leaking the data to public scrutiny. That risks panic. That risks exploitation. That risks— "Everything," Mara said. "Everything you hide behind risk." He studied her for a long moment, like someone weighing an unknown element. "You think you're protecting them," he said. "But the world is messy. Sometimes containment prevents chaos. Do you want to jeopardize every child in the name of principle?" The question landed like a hand on her sternum. She had rehearsed answers in the quiet hours, but now, faced by a man whose work had written him into the bureaucratic bones of the world, her resolutions seemed like naive models. Still, she could not turn away. "I want to prevent them being commodified," she said. "I want a process that recognizes them as persons, not assets. If your system can't do that, then you would hand them to systems that are even less forgiving," Elias interrupted. "Dr. Ellison, you have no idea what you open when you pry at these doors." Thorax's expression, for all his alien distance, became something like exasperated sympathy. "Elias Voss knows the ledger because he keeps it," he said. "He defends containment because he was taught that control saves species. You both operate from honest premises. The fracture is that you cannot reconcile them without damage." The air in the chamber soured with old arguments. The children in their pods shifted, indifferent to human jurisprudence.
Between herself and institutions, between Thorax and his own kind for bringing her here, between the fragile hope that truth could mend a world and the reality that some truths blow things open in ways that cannot be controlled. Then Elias turned to Thorax with emotion that was almost ceremonial. "You came without permission," he said. His voice was low, threaded with more than procedure. "And you brought a human into a classified site." Thorax's eyes shimmered with the old weariness. "I brought her because she answered," he said, "because she had the right to know." Elias's mouth flattened. He glanced briefly at the records interface Mara had opened. "You defect from your orders policy at your own peril," he said, "and you risk making allies of people who will weaponize the information you expose." "Then do what custodian you think keeps them safe," Mara snapped, her patience worn thin to the bone. "But do not call it mercy when your solution is to lock them in silence." The argument ricocheted until something raw and ugly happened. A door in the back opened and boots clattered. More agents, more quietly efficient instruments. Someone had called backup. Mara felt the corridor around them become smaller, the air thickening with the stink of inevitable containment. Elias' posture shifted from negotiator to executor. Thorax's shoulders lowered with the tiredness of someone who had seen this script too many times before. It was in that frozen breath, when the two ideologies that had been polite until then met like tectonic plates, that the first fracture lodged. Elias reached for a containment device at his hip, a small instrument that glowed with lethal intent, designed to immobilize alien physiology. Thorax's hand moved faster than the human reaction allowed, and in the flick of an old hurt and a new betrayal, the device discharged toward him. The air broke with a sound like a star's small death. Thorax reeled, not as a human would, more like a column of light bent by pressure. He stumbled into a pod, and the child inside woke with a startled cry that was small and terrifying because it was human. Mara moved before she thought. She lunged, hands clumsy, and pushed Elias away with a force that surprised all three of them. "You don't get to hurt him," she hissed. "He's been trying to help us." Elias's face was unreadable for a heartbeat. Then he said, very quietly, "He is not yours to defend." Thorax collapsed to one knee, light folding in on itself like a cathedral lamp. His skin shimmered with an iridescence Mara had never noticed before, and a dark smear of something that might have been blood, might have been conductive fluid, pulled across his jaw. He pressed a hand to his side and made a sound that did not belong to his people. It was thin with injury and surprise. Mara's chest clenched so hard it hurt. The fracture was no longer only between ideologies. Now it cleaved them personally.
Elias had acted in the name of containment, and containment had the shape of violence. Thorax had been the bargain breaker. Mara had defended him. Trust snapped. "Why?" she demanded, voice raw. "Why do this? He showed us evidence. He offered." Elias' voice was a flat instrument of law. Some things must remain sealed. Some breaches cost lives. You will learn. Mara looked at Thorax, at the color that clung to his skin, at the quiet way his hand trembled. A simple calculus formed itself in her mind. The more she knew, the more dangerous she became. The more she protected Thorax, the more she exposed herself to those whose empathy was ledgered out in black ink. Her hands shook. She had come here to break the silence around her sister, and found instead a world whose defenses were wired into violence. Love and duty and conscience were no longer abstractions. They were angles in a dangerous architecture where a wrong move could mean death. The children cried, and the agents moved in, and the chamber felt like a crucible. In the heat of that betrayal, the seat of her convictions quivered. Did she press on and risk even more? Or did she fold and let the custodianship swallow yet another set of voices into silence? Thorax's breathing hitched. He looked at her like someone finding a shard of home in a foreign sky. "Do not let them take the proof," he whispered, the words scraping with pain. "If you stay quiet, you become complicit." Mara's hand went to the pocket where June's folded name lay like a pulse. Trust had been broken, alliances shattered. Yet the hush of the facility, the children's cries, the thin sound of Thorax's pain, all braided into a single fierce obligation she could not deny. She made a choice, not a grand one, but a precise, dangerous, practical decision. She would make the evidence public. She would not let Elias convert suffering into asset. And she would do it even though she knew the cost might be everything she had left: career, freedom, perhaps even blood. The fracture had opened, and whatever splinters or new paths it left would be bone and decision, not silence. As Thorax leaned against a pod, struggling to steady himself, Mara spun her recorder on and hit transmit to a secure channel she had prepared for the worst. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded like a desperate engine. "This is Mara Ellison," she said, and her words released a truth that would not be easily contained. "You are about to see what your governments have kept from you." Outside, the lake held its coin of moonlight, indifferent and patient. Inside, alliances had ruptured and trust bled in the glow of machine light. The fracture had been made. The world would never again be the shape it had been before someone decided to make the ledger equal to the truth. The room filled with the sound of alarms and the small, urgent cries of children who had been kept to the margins of a humanity debating its conscience. Mara knew, in a way she had never known before, that some doors, once opened, demanded everything. The transmission was a blade that cut the room into two. One side, the practiced calm of agents trained to tidy chaos. The other, the raw, public light Mara had thrown into a place meant to rot in classified dark. Alarms screamed. Boots advanced. The children in their pods cried like a single, small, furious organ. Elias moved with the efficient cruelty of a man who had rehearsed every containment scenario. He barked orders, hands snapping codes into a slate.
Men fanned out to secure the exits. For a half-breath, he looked like the cold center of the world, implacable, precise, the ledger incarnate. Then something shifted in him that no file could have predicted. A micro-gesture, a tightening around his jaw, the look of a man who watched a child awaken and saw in the small face the shape of his own niece maybe, or the face of a country he'd promised to protect. The calculus that had lived in him, of control and stability, shimmered under the bright light of a truth he'd spent a lifetime defending. "Get them out," he said suddenly, not as a command to seize, but as an order to evacuate. Confusion rippled through the team. He repeated it, softer, rawer. "Now. Evacuate for immediate humanitarian transfer. No seizures." His hand hovered near the containment instrument, then trembled and retreated. Thorax breathing hitched. Mara saw the flicker behind his alien eyes. Hope, and then fear that hope would be a weapon wielded against him. Elias was not yielding because he had turned soft. He was recalibrating the ledger for reasons Mara could not know, and for today, the ledger tilted toward mercy. They moved like a frantic, improvised orchestra. Thorax, though hurt, anchored the children's pods with a field that pulsed in colors Mara did not have words for. The light steadied fragile heartbeats, made data streams readable. Mara coordinated via her recorder, calling names, documenting, uploading. Eli's team packaged the pods in sterile containment units, eyes darting between procedures and the woman who had forced their hand. The crisis swelled when an external link pinged. A remote custodian node, a strike team already in transit to sanitize and reclassify. Mara's throat closed. If the strike arrived before they dispersed, every proof could be erased. Every child rerouted into a system even colder than the one in this room. "There's not enough time," she said, voice thin with terror. "We need to move them now and get the feed out to public servers." Thorax's expression was both an apology and a plea. He reached for Mara with a hand that trembled, and when it closed around hers, it was like being held by a ship in a storm, steady, inevitable. "There is another way," he said. "I can create a corridor, one that leads to the archive seam. It will be temporary, and I will have to put myself in its wake. It will mark me in a way that cannot be undone." Mara's mind cataloged the possibility, like a scientist. Probabilities, losses, the cost to Thorax. Her heart did something simpler and louder. It refused the logic of losing him. "You can't," she said. "You promised." "I promised to uphold orders," he corrected, the edge of pain sharper than the injury. "But I have also learned that orders can be wrong. To open is to risk and to love. This corridor will move them to sanctuary. It will burn my signatures into the seam. Your species will find the children, but not the footpath I take. I will be hidden, and perhaps for you, lost." The room spun small and precise around that choice. Elias's gaze landed on Thorax, and then slid to Mara. And for the first time, his legalism seemed to fracture into something like mourning. "If he does that, he disappears from our registers," Elias said. "He will be untraceable. Your people will not be able to compel him to testify. Then he will save them in the only language they understand," Mara shot back, feeling the world narrow to the size of her own chest. "And maybe he will be free of the ledger that made him guard cruelty." There was no time to write a manifesto. There was only a corridor to build and a life to fold into it. Thorax knelt beside the pods, hands moving in the alien choreography of someone who could make physics agree to mercy. Light lanced from his palms, ribbons of archival code threading around each unit. Children blinked, eyes small and human, absorbing the promise of a future they had not asked for. "Take them," Thorax said to Elias, voice wind thin now. "Transfer to public channels. Protect the evidence. Promise me you will not let them become ledgers." Elias, for once, looked like a man deciding whether to honor a human plea over a written order. He hesitated, then nodded once, a brittle thing that tasted of both surrender and determination. "I'll stand by this," he said. "But know this, what you do will make enemies. It will change everything." Thorax's reply was a small smile that made Mara's throat ache. He turned to her, fingers lingering on the fabric of her sleeve, as if to memorize the warmth. "You carry a weight, Mara Ellison. I will carry a consequence. We will each balance this ledger in our own bodies." "Don't make me lose you," she whispered, words jagged. He reached up and brushed a foreign thumb against her cheek. The touch was a benediction and a burn. "If losing me is the price so you can gain them," he said, "then I will pay it willingly. But remember, I will carry you like the center of an orbit, even if I am gone." Mara clung to him, as though a human hug could hold back an alien covenant. The corridor he formed flared and then opened like a mouth of cold fire. Men and women labored, and the pods moved into the seam, carried on Thorax's light like fragile boats. For a heartbeat, time elongated. Instruments hummed, records streamed, Elias barked final instructions, and the strike team pinged distant, delayed. Then Thorax faltered. The effort of the corridor had cut through him with physical cruelty. Not only the wound Elias had inflicted, but the toll of violating his own order. His skin glittered with something like frost and blood. He sagged against Mara, breath shallow. "Go," he managed. "Finish the transfer. Live within the truth." Mara refused. She could not let him be an anonymous saint. "I am not leaving you," she said. "Not like this." Thorax smiled, a calm constellation. "You will live," he said. "You will make a world that remembers. That is enough." Elias stood close, a man of laws and sudden fierce mercy. He looked at the two of them, a scientist who had become a beacon and an envoy who had become sacrifice, and the ledger in his hand felt brittle. He knelt then, surprising both of them, and placed his gloved hand atop Thorax's. The gesture was not trust, it was a reconciliation of code and conscience. "Promise me you'll be seen," Elias said to Mara, voice small, "not as an enemy of order, but as someone who demanded better of it." "I promise," she said, and the words were both oath and plea. Thorax exhaled, the sound like a star going quiet. The corridor completed its work. One by one, the pods entered the seam and vanished, carried to an archive node that would pulse with their new lives. The last unit moved. The seam shuttered shut like a mouth closing on a secret. Mara tried to follow, her hands scrabbled at the edge of the seam, as if she could hold on to some fragment of light and bring him back. But the seam was not for retrieval. It sealed not only places, but balances. Thorax's hand slipped from hers, and where his fingers had left warmth, the air stung. He pressed his forehead to hers in a gesture older than speech. "Find me in the ledger you tilt," he said. "If love is the only rebellion, let it be ours." Tears pricked at Mara's eyes. There were no grand speeches, only the small, terrible intimacy of two beings choosing sacrifice over safety for the sake of others. Elias stood, the lines around his mouth softened as if by rain. As the seam closed, Thorax's form thinned, not gone, but folded into a ripple that would be a map only to those willing to pay with loss. Mara felt the cold of absence like a physical thing. She could have screamed, demanded the heavens unmake their choices. Instead, she reached for the ledger she'd already started. Proofs, records, the broadcast that had set this into motion. Elias placed his hand on Mara's shoulder, a steadiness that felt like an apology. "You changed the ledger tonight," he said. "You change what we protect. Expect repaying and reprisals, expect allies and enemies, but also expect truth." Mara looked out at the place where Thorax had been, at the faint scar of light that the seam left behind, and allowed herself to be unmoored by grief that tasted like sacrament. She had lost him to a duty he could not survive, and won 10 children their lives. The symmetry was ugly and holy.
Elias stood, the lines around his mouth softened as if by rain. As the seam closed, Thorax's form thinned, not gone, but folded into a ripple that would be a map only to those willing to pay with loss. Mara felt the cold of absence like a physical thing. She could have screamed, demanded the heavens unmake their choices. Instead, she reached for the ledger she'd already started. Proofs, records, the broadcast that had set this into motion. Elias placed his hand on Mara's shoulder, a steadiness that felt like an apology. "You changed the ledger tonight," he said. "You change what we protect. Expect repaying and reprisals. Expect allies and enemies. But also, expect truth." Mara looked out at the place where Thorax had been, at the faint scar of light that the seam left behind, and allowed herself to be unmoored by grief that tasted like sacrament. She had lost him to a duty he could not survive, and won 10 children their lives. The symmetry was ugly and holy.
She lifted her recorder and spoke, not only to servers or agents, but to the strange, exposed world that now had a new map. "This is Mara Ellison," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "You know where to look. You will not unsee this." Outside, the lake breathed under an indifferent moon. Inside, a woman who had learned the cost of knowledge and love sat with the echo of an alien thumb on her cheek, and the soft knowledge that some prices were worth more than any ledger could measure. The world had been tilted, and the tilt demanded repair. She would begin, scientifically, politically, humanly, by keeping the promise they'd all made, to honor what had been freed, and to mourn, fiercely, what had been given away. They called it the Ellison Disclosure before she could name it herself, a night-splintering upload that reshaped policy meetings and dinner conversations, that pulled secret files into sunlight and turned redactions into evidence. Governments sputtered. Committees convened. Protesters and mourners braided together outside embassies. The ledger keepers promised inquiry. The public demanded justice. Mara learned quickly that truth does not land as a single event, but as a series of arguments all trying to be louder than grief. Elias stayed.